So yeah, so as Richard said, I'm just at the end of my vascular surgery training and just about to start my consultant practice at Manchester Royal. But for the last 5 years, I've been working with the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh via the Trainees Committee initially, but it's now a broader college initiative to try and understand the reasons and the solutions behind bullying and undermining behaviour in surgery and also in the wider NHS and beyond. And any of us who've been around the NHS for a number of years will all have seen or experienced this type of problem. So tonight I'm just going to talk about the nature of the problem and some data behind it, hopefully give you some understanding of what we've learned about this topic in the last 5 years, and also some advice on what we think is a sensible approach if you perceive that you've been bullied or you've observed it happening to some of your colleagues. So this is the first slide. This is our campaign that we started 5 years ago, and it started off as in response really to some data that I'll show you later on about the frequency at which our surgical members were bullied. And we have members who are surgeons, but we also have members who are dentists. We have allied healthcare professionals across the full range of specialties within the NHS. So basically any healthcare professional who's involved in surgical practice can get involved with our college, and our campaign aims to respect that and not just make this a focus on doctors. I thought it'd be useful to start off with some definitions of what undermining and bullying actually is. I think we've all palpably got a sense of what that might be, but it's not necessarily clear exactly what the definitions are. So there are actually definitions stated by the GMC. The undermining definition is behaviour that subverts, weakens or wears away confidence, and obviously that can take many forms. And the GMC also defined bullying as behaviour that hurts or frightens someone who's less powerful, often forcing them to do something they do not want to do. Now, the key thing with these definitions is that this is not something that can be determined by other people. So by definition, if you believe or perceive that you're experiencing this behaviour from someone else, then bullying has taken place. And that can be quite a difficult thing for people to get their heads around. And when we started presenting this, there was quite a lot of resistance to that idea. But the fact is that if someone does feel hurt or frightened by someone who is more powerful, or they feel compelled to do something that they wouldn't normally want to do, then it doesn't matter whether somebody else feels that that's bullying or not, because the person perceives themselves to be a victim of bullying. And that has innumerable effects that I'll go on to discuss. So it's the perceptions of this behaviour in the individual that is important, not what anybody else thinks. Now, one of the difficulties with bullying is that it's not a crime. So there are lots of oppressive behaviours and negative behaviours that are illegal, such as harassment, treating people differently because of protected characteristics. But bullying doesn't necessarily come under that umbrella. And there isn't really any legal recourse for individuals who perceive that they're being bullied. And one of the issues that people have is that they feel powerless. And we all know that even if you feel victimised or harassed as a result of a protected characteristic, that in itself is difficult enough to manage, even with the protection of the law. But when it comes to bullying, there isn't really any legal recourse to people who perceive, that they're being bullied. And that makes it very difficult for victims, and it makes it very difficult to know what to do for the best. So I want to look at some data now. So this isn't a largely trainee based talk, and I don't want to give the impression that this is just a trainee problem, because we all know that it isn't. But the fact is that the data to show the frequency of bullying and undermining behaviour is largely rooted in data that emerges from trainee groups, because they tend to be surveyed more than other groups in the NHS. So as a junior doctor, every year you do Health Education England training survey, and you also do the GMC training survey. And some of those are mandatory. And that means that we have a fairly robust evidence base for trainees. We also have some data to reflect what's going on in consultant practice and also in in allied health professional practice. But the data isn't as frequently reported and isn't perhaps as much in the collective consciousness as the trainee data is. But you'll see here that the image on the left shows the proportion of people who have perceived that they've been bullied during their last training post, or that they've witnessed bullying or harassment by other staff in their last training post. So this might only be in the last 6 months to a year, which is the frequency at which trainees tend to rotate, as you know. And you'll see that it's 12% perceive that themselves and 13% have observed it in others once or twice. But some people, a small minority of 1%, frequently observe it. And although that figure might not sound particularly high, that if you put that across the whole of the NHS, that is a huge number of people who feel that they're being bullied or undermined or harassed. And that is a huge burden for those people to share. You're talking about thousands of people with those proportions. The other problem is with this whole situation is displayed on the right-hand side, in that of those people surveyed who reported that they'd observed or been bullied themselves, less than a quarter of people had the confidence to report it. And that tells you two things. It tells you that a lot of trainees just are told to get their head down, carry on, things will get better in your next placement. And also that there's a complete lack of confidence in reporting systems hosted by the trusts. It's the trust's responsibility to have an anti-bullying policy, and all trusts do have that. But there's obviously a lack of confidence in them, and that probably comes from seeing how people have been treated who've been bullied and reported it. And we're well aware at the college and through our experiences of talking to people during this work that a large proportion of trusts' policies on bullying and undermining behaviour are not fit for purpose. So like I said, this is not just a trainee issue. So this is a survey that was given to the membership of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh back in 2015. We got over 1,000 responses, and you'll see that from that group, a third of people perceived that they'd been bullied, and a third had witnessed bullying of a colleague, and only a third felt able to report it. So like I said, this is a survey of members and fellows who could comprise trainees and consultants and allied health professionals who are members of the college. So this is obviously a much higher proportion than the overall picture across all specialties that the Health Education England survey found. And what that tells you is that this issue is particularly problematic in the surgical workforce. And there's other comparable data in paediatrics and obstetrics and gynecology that shows similar figures. And those are the specialties that tend to have the biggest problem, for want of a better word. And in my own specialty in vascular surgery, there was even higher proportions. And what that means is you have a workforce where half our trainees have experienced or witnessed bullying, undermining or harassment. And that's quite a stark finding and has obviously given us cause for reflection as a profession. And again, 85% of the people surveyed who were from the Vascular Trainees Association were unsatisfied with the response that they received from their trust or their deanery. So when we've been going around the country talking to people about this over the last 5 to 6 years, we've often tried to think about what drives this kind of behaviour. And we've basically divided it into internal and external forces. So there's obviously a power differential that plays its part in bullying and undermining behaviour. And we know that healthcare is hugely hierarchical. Palpably, that seems to be reducing as things become a bit more progressive. But if you speak to some of my more senior colleagues who are close to retirement, they'll tell you horror stories of the severe hierarchy and the kind of stark displays of power that went on in all kinds of departments. And there's certainly an egocentric kind of driver for that. The other thing is people do it to impress people. So again, as a display of power and prowess, particularly senior clinicians. And that can often counterintuitively perhaps reflect a lack of self-esteem. So aggressive displays of the power differential often lead us to think that underlying that is poor self-esteem or lack of confidence, things going on outside of work that might be driving that behaviour. And there's also a proportion of people who are unable to read situations, and their behaviour may not be intended to be undermining or bullying. But as I said at the beginning, if that behaviour is perceived to be such, then that person has been bullied or undermined. And so there's a significant group of people that we've spoken to who've not actually realised that their behaviour was causing damage. And that's something that we've tried to address through educational programmes and the like. But there's also external pressures that drive this kind of behaviour. And it doesn't matter what your job is in the NHS, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, there's enormous clinical pressure. So there's a reducing workforce. There's obviously the pandemic. There's difficulty in ever increasing patient demands, the demands of their families. And those demands are perfectly legitimate a lot of the time. But obviously the family at the time, when they've got an ill relative, doesn't necessarily contextualise it in reduced healthcare budgets, reduced workforce, increased clinical pressures. And so that can build on the shoulders of the individual clinicians and healthcare workers. And that can often be externalised by people losing their temper, feeling under pressure, reacting to it in a negative way. And we're all human and we all do that. But we just need to be aware of that. There's also significant pressure from the managers. One of the things that we've tried to address in this work is that doctors are often excluded from management systems, particularly trainees. So I've just come to the end of my training. And the first time I've ever met a chief executive of a hospital was in preparation for my consultant interview. So I've basically gone through 12 or 13 years where I've not met a single chief executive in any of the hospitals that I've worked in. And that generates a divide between junior doctors and trainees of other professions and the management. And what we perhaps don't appreciate fully is that the managers are under just as much pressure as we are. The pressures are different. But I know from speaking to some managers more recently that they have huge pressures from Department of Health that we don't really see. And so there is a collective increase in pressure across all parts of the system. It's not just on the shop floor. There's also a heritage of institutional behaviour where there's a cycle of abuse where people have felt, oh, well, we were bullied and treated badly, but I came through the process and it made me the practitioner I am today. And there's definitely people who still believe that. They think if you can't handle the heat, then you should get out of the kitchen, particularly in surgery. But obviously, as I'll come to, that's not what we want for our trainees or for our consultants or for our colleagues in other professions. And we talked about personal problems impacting on how people represent themselves and how they behave with other people within their team. It's difficult to separate work and life. And there are obviously times when people have things going on at home that will compromise their ability to do their job and respond in the way that they'd normally do. We understand that. It's just about finding ways of mitigating that. And the other thing I wanted to mention was a phenomenon called empathy decline, which some of you may be familiar with. So this is a kind of well-documented phenomenon in the literature. We did a study looking at how foundation doctors responded to their first job and how they perceived their ability to empathise with their patients. And what we found was that when junior doctors start on the first day, they're very naturally empathic people. And over time, over the first few months of their clinical practice, they feel their ability to empathise with their patients is diminished because of the clinical and work pressures that they are placed under. And that's a fairly worrying thing for me, because we know that empathy is the root of good clinical practice. And if you can't empathise with your patients, then you're going to struggle to treat them as effectively as they deserve. But what tends to happen is that the clinical pressures and the pressures of doing the job squeeze out people's ability to empathise, and they purely focus on the tasks that they're given to perform. And all the evidence shows that compromises patient care. And you see this in different levels of healthcare. So whenever people are promoted to an increased level of responsibility, they lose their ability to empathise. because of the increased pressure on them and the increased stress. And that happens across all professions within the health services. Again, that's something to be aware of as an individual. So I'm just about to start my consultant practice, and because I've read a bit about this, I understand that it's something I need to be careful of and guard against, but it's not always easy to do that. So this is a picture of the junior doctor strike that we'll all be familiar with you, and it's perhaps particularly relevant at the moment because the way it's looking, there may be future industrial action, not just within the trainees, but across the profession. The reason I put this up there is because what we need is a culture change within the NHS. And that is the only thing that's really going to solve this very difficult problem. But the problem we have is that there is a punitive culture within the NHS overall. So the details of the junior doctor strike will be familiar to many of you. But essentially a contract was forced on the junior doctors against their will. And that in itself could be seen as bullying and undermining. But that came from the health secretary at the time. Now, I'm sure he would not consider his behaviour to be that way, or to intend it to be that way. But I was listening to an interview with him on the radio recently where he said he regretted the way that some of the negotiations around the strike had been carried out. But what that's done is it's militarised a large generation of trainee doctors. And that might feed into what we're about to experience over the next 12 months. But again, the way we felt at the time as junior doctors were that we were being undermined, and we were listening to cabinet ministers come on the radio every morning and, infer that we weren't taking adequate care of our patients, that we were letting the profession down, that we weren't being professional, all this kind of thing. And that in itself is undermining and bullying behaviour. The problem we've got, obviously, is there's a dissonance between the politicians who serve 5-year terms and us as healthcare professionals who spend our whole career trying to achieve things for our patients. And there is a dissonance there that's never going to go away. But what we've tried to do is appeal to politicians to understand that the culture is delivered from the top down in many cases. And that's something that we've tried to address as well. And the other issue we have is the generational issue. So again, this is, obviously there are generalizations here, but if you look at the sociology behind the different generations, so there was the silent generation whose parents had gone through the war or 2 wars, and they learnt that they must follow orders. That was the culture of the country at the time, and lots of them were in the military and all the rest of it. And then when they became healthcare practitioners, that was their mindset. And so the baby boomers who were their trainees had to endure lots of oppressive behaviours. It was a kind of militaristic culture where the orders were delivered from an autocratic surgeon or consultant or other professional, and the juniors were just meant to get on with it for the greater good. And it was the baby boomers who really began to change things when they became consultants, when they became people in positions of power. And there was obviously a reflexive kind of social liberalism after the war, which led to their change in attitude. And it's actually the baby boomers who people like myself as a millennial have to thank, because they set up a lot of the organisations that I'll mention on the next slide that have kind of started a sea change. So if you go back through the history books, medicine always been hugely autocratic, with no power within the trainee group or the junior members of various professions, and all the power contained within kind of figureheads. And that's really changed over the last 2 or 3 decades. And basically what we have now is a group of doctors who are empowered. So it was the baby boomers who set up the Association of Surgeons in Training, and they set up the trainees committee at the college, and lots of other Royal Colleges now have trainees committees. And that's a clear sociological shift of power from the autocratic leaders to the shop floor and the trainees. And on my previous slide, I had an image of Generation Z, who are social media orientated and who are now completely literate and more than keen to share their feelings on social media, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, and it's easy to trivialize that. But what that actually does is it frees Generation Z and millennial doctors to air their views. And where in the past people may have been bullied or undermined and had no outlet, this stuff is all over the internet now, and people have been empowered to talk about it in public fora. And that's empowered a new generation. And the bottom line is that trainees and junior members of other healthcare professions are just not going to put up with it anymore in the way that previous generations have. And that's just reflective of the times that we live in. But there is a generational difference there. And I've heard clinicians who are in their late 50s and early 60s say the same things about, this is how I trained, this is what you have to do. But those people have to understand that times have changed and society has changed, and the juniors have a completely different worldview. And again, if you're talking about unintended consequences of behaviour, that's something that is a duty of all senior clinicians to understand. But it works both ways. And so perhaps as junior trainees, just starting our careers, understanding that sociological divide might be able to help you understand people's behaviours better and discuss it with them and help them see that what they consider to be normal is not necessarily what is now acceptable, because often it is unintentional. So I just wanted to talk about the effects of bullying as well, because they're quite stark. So this is an old survey from the GMC in 2014, but the data is pretty similar even later than that. So this is a mandatory survey of all trainee doctors in the UK. And so there's a sample size of over 52,000. And basically what the figure on the right shows is that in responders who reported that they'd been bullied or undermined, all their separate scores on the quality of their supportive environment, their overall satisfaction with the job, the quality of feedback they get, the quality of their induction, their access to educational resources, and so on, all those domains on the right-hand side of the chart, they scored lower than the mean of people who didn't report that they've been bullied. So what that shows is that bullying in itself is obviously damaging, but it also affects every single aspect of that individual's practice, even down to the quality of their study leave, the quality of their regional teaching, and even how they perceive handover. And that's quite a kind of clear indication that this behaviour is hugely damaging across all aspects of an individual's working life. So this was a review article that one of our F1s put together, kind of systematic review of the literature around bullying and undermining behaviour in surgery. And what we found was that women, people in ethnic minority groups and non-heterosexual individuals were particularly at risk of this kind of behaviour, and were also particularly deterred from pursuing surgical careers. And also that female nurses, medical students and surgeons are more likely to be a victim of sexual harassment. And you might think that those are all to be expected. We kind of instinctively feel, or at least I do, that I've seen people in ethnic minority groups and from other minorities, and in particular women in surgery, have a much tougher time than I've had as a white male from the northwest of England who works in the northwest of England. And again, that feeds into this kind of behaviour. There are increasing numbers of women in surgery, but they're still in a significant minority compared to the proportion of people who go through medical school. And the same is true of ethnic minority groups and non-heterosexual individuals. Again, there are people out there doing very good work to promote the interests of those people and trying to change the culture on how they can be treated fairly within the profession, but there's still a lot of work to do on that. Now, this is all data from surgery, but I'm sure looking at your own specialties in your own practice, you've probably identified similar kinds of phenomena. So when we've been around the country presenting this, we have had quite a hostile reaction to some of it, particularly initially when we started, because there really hadn't been many people talking about it before. It was always known that it had gone on, But now we have the data and we have people's stories, and we're able to communicate it in a kind of formal way with the heft of the college behind it. And there are other groups of people doing this kind of work around the country as well. But one of the things that we found that clinicians couldn't resist is that there's a huge amount of evidence that this kind of behaviour directly harms patients. And that was a bit of a sea change of thinking for a lot of our colleagues, who'd always thought that the autocratic system of do as I say, I'm the boss, so get on with it. We were bullied, so you should be bullied. That's how you toughen up to become a surgeon. They all thought that that was in the patient's best interest as well, when we dug a little deeper. But actually, there's a huge amount of evidence that this kind of behaviour compromises patient care. And I've seen it in my own, the places I've worked as well. And if you look at if you flick through a lot of the GMC hearings, you'll find that underlying clinical malpractice is a history of bullying and undermining from a particular individual. And the three big cases that are relevant across the NHS that we've all had to take lessons from are the Mid-Staff's Francis report, the Morecambe Bay investigation into maternal care, and the Patterson case, which some of you may not be aware of. It was essentially a breast surgeon who was completely autocratic in his practice, was not going along with MDT outcomes. A large part of that was in the private sector, but essentially he was doing inappropriate operations, and he's now in prison as a result. And if you look into the inquiries behind all these three, major incidents, then you'll find that there's a culture of bullying and undermining and harassment that goes alongside it. And it's actually pretty rare for serious, prolonged clinical malpractice not to have that background. And our theory is that once people find that they can get away with that kind of behaviour, then they take more risks clinically and perhaps are clinically negligent in a way that they wouldn't have been had they felt able to be challenged. And that's something for us all to consider. And the bottom line is that once you speak to other consultants or other professionals about their views on bullying and harassment, and they initially poo-poo it, once you can kind of link it with poor clinical outcomes, then it's impossible to get away from. And if there was a medication or an operation or a procedure that was having the harm to patients that this kind of behaviour is also conferring, then we wouldn't be able to offer those treatments. So one of the trickiest questions we get asked is, what do you do if you are being bullied or if you've witnessed it in a colleague? We've talked about the fact that the reporting systems are not up to scratch in many cases. So what do we do? How do you actually handle these cases? Because it obviously can be very difficult. And now we can't promise to have all the answers in every case, but I can talk about some general principles on how to manage things in what can be a very difficult and stressful situation where it can be difficult to think clearly. So hopefully this will help a little bit. So this was a document from the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, creating supportive environments that's available online that we fed into as a college. And they basically split up interventions into reactive and proactive. Obviously, we'd prefer it if things were proactive, but you do have to be reactive as well. So things like monitoring visits, using the data to highlight areas of bad practice, because the data can all be divided into particular units and hospitals. Referral to professional support bodies, human resources procedures we've talked about, but we accept that they're not always as good as they should be. Mediation is something that can be really useful, and there are unions out there that offer mediation and other clinicians that are trained in mediation. And that's something we're working on as a college at the moment, trying to expand that service across the NHS. And there are also courses that you can do that kind of take people through how to manage this behaviour if they find there's a particular problem within the department or within their own practice. But there are proactive interventions as well. So trainee forums are really important because they often highlight areas of difficult behaviour that perhaps weren't previously known to the leadership within hospitals. Mentoring is a useful tool. So we all have, as trainees, educational supervisors. In my experience, they've been excellent. But as I'm about to start my consultant practice, you need a mentor, you need a go-to person as a junior, mid-career or senior consultant. You always need people to be around to discuss difficult cases with, but also to discuss difficult behaviours with. And if you're having problems with interpersonal relationships with other members of the team, it's important that you have someone you can discuss that with. Everybody needs a mentor, no matter how senior you are. They can always help. And the cliche of a problem shared is a problem halved is often true. Schwartz rounds, I don't know if any of you have experience of that, but we offer them at My Trust at the moment. And this is a way of discussing the psychology and emotion of when things have gone wrong or when people have had negative experiences. And again, they can kind of build a collective shield and can help people realize that, you know, the behaviors that they've experienced are not necessarily just affecting them, that other people may have had similar experiences. They can learn from them and develop strategies on how to deal with things. Like I say, there is GMC, Royal College and faculty guidance on how to deal with this. I've read lots of them and some of them are better than others. Obviously, you'll have your own resources depending on which college or other group you're affiliated to. But I'll highlight some resources towards the end that I think are particularly good. And departmental away days, team building, that kind of thing is really under threat at the moment. So when I started out as a house officer, we used to have regular social events, not just amongst the trainees, but amongst the whole group. So we used to, you know, have an annual, summer party with the consultants, and there was Christmas parties as well. There was a real kind of collective desire to socialise, and I think COVID has really killed that off. It's killed off lots of meetings. So again, kind of regional meetings and getting to know people in different hospitals. That seems to have died off over the last 2 years for understandable reasons. But I think it's really important we get that back. And often seeing people out of work makes you understand them better. You can understand where they're coming from. It leads to less interpersonal conflict. It's a really important thing that we've lost, that kind of collegiate atmosphere within the NHS. And I think it's really important we do our utmost to try and retrieve that, because I think it's possible and it's also a benefit for all of us. Resilience training is a difficult one, because what we don't want is to make people resilient to bullying and undermining behaviour. The way we look at it is that we want to train people to be resilient to the inevitable pressures of clinical practice and make them more robust as individuals to the potential pressures that are on your shoulders as a clinician or as a healthcare professional, because there are always going to be those pressures. It's unavoidable. But what we don't want to do is justify the negative and oppressive behaviours by training people to be resilient to that. And the two are very different. So I've tried to keep this as simple as possible. And obviously there are nuances to every individual case. But these are the broad bits of advice that we found to be the most robust. Document everything. So just as you would in a clinical case, your note keeping is a really important record of what's happened. And what we found is that people who haven't documented everything, when they have reported it and they've been asked to relate their experiences, then they found themselves to be incoherent, and it's obviously difficult to do anyway. And it can be emotionally stressing and physically distressing. If you've got everything documented about your experiences and what's happened to you and when, it means you don't have to spend time and effort remembering it and trying to recall it in a difficult context in a meeting. It can be really difficult. So documentation of everything is essential. You've got to remain professional. It's really tempting not to. And it's really tempting to make counter accusations, and some of those may well be justified, but you have to remain professional just as you would with patient care, and stick to the facts. And people have often struggled because they've either extrapolated or they've exaggerated what are perfectly legitimate claims, but as soon as something is found to be exaggerated or extrapolated, then they run into problems because they lose credibility overall. And the way we analogize this is that this is exactly what you would do in patient care. You would document everything, you would remain professional, and you would stick to the facts when communicating with patients. And the same is true when trying to deal with this behaviour. And I accept, and we all accept, that none of this is easy for all the reasons that we've discussed. It'd be churlish to suggest that it was otherwise. If you report bullying, inevitably you're going to find it very difficult, and it's going to be a long process that is going to cause a lot of stress and anxiety. And that is why it's so important to find allies. It doesn't have to be at work. It's better if it is at work. But you need to be able to talk about these things with people. You need to be able to talk about your experiences and get advice from people that you trust. And it's pretty rare, in my experience of speaking to people who've been in a situation, that there is no one around them that they can talk to about this. And you just have to do it. You have to find someone that you trust that can understand the situation that you're in. And you have to use them as a sounding board. And it's not always easy to do that, as I've said, but I think you must do it. Internalizing it and keeping it to yourself makes things a whole lot worse. And nobody can cope with that. It's an impossible task on top of the clinical pressures. So as a victim or as an observer, it's often easier to do nothing and hope that it blows over. But what you have to remember is that this is compromising your ability to deliver the patient care that you want to deliver. And so doing nothing is wrong. And the GMC duties of a doctor quite clearly state that you shouldn't accept this behaviour, and you should do everything you can to mitigate it and to stop it and to investigate it if you're in a position to do so. That is one of the duties of ourselves as professional doctors. And I imagine the same is true of other healthcare professionals too. Obviously, it's easier to do nothing and hope things blow over, but that is not the right thing to do, however hard it may seem to do so. We've already talked about finding allies. And if nothing else, even if nothing comes of it, even if you feel that it was ultimately futile, at least you've done the right thing, and you can have some sense of personal vindication that you've done the right thing, and that hopefully you've started a chain of events that may bring other people in who report similar situations with the same person or with the same department. Again, I accept that these are all easy words to say, but my experience of people who have reported it, this is how they've described it to me. I think in general, this is the chain of command that we would recommend. So try and sort things out within your own team, first of all, because that's where the interpersonal relationships are often the strongest. It's also where that behaviour is most likely to be experienced. So I accept that can be difficult. But most people have allies within their department. And if you can work it out amongst yourselves, then it's obviously, that's better for everybody. Like I say, there are trust policies on all this. You will find them to be of varying quality, and there's obviously a lack of confidence in them at the moment. But there are trusts that have good practice, and there are very good managers and senior clinicians within the trust who will be able to help manage this behaviour. And every trust now has a freedom to speak up guardian, who is an independent person who you can speak to about problems within your area of expertise and within your departments. And I would strongly recommend that you use them because they're very well-trained people. They fully understand these issues, and they're a wealth of resource for people who find themselves in difficult situations. But ultimately, if you're not having any success with people in your own trust, speak to your Royal College, speak to your defence union, who also have people who are on hand to offer counselling, to offer mediation, to offer personal support. And you'd actually be surprised what range of resources are out there once you go looking for them. They could be better, and that's something we're working on as a college. But I think there are services out there, and there are people who are well trained to be able to deal with these kind of problems and give you sensible advice. We've collated a large amount of resources from across a variety of Royal Colleges, unions, and professional bodies. We've put all this together on our website, which you can find by Googling anti-bullying RCS ED. There's a very good website put together by the team there that gives you all sorts of information. This is just a snippet of it on the screenshot. Interestingly, the button that gets the most clicks is the one that said, "Am I a bully?" And I think that reflects the fact that a lot of people's behaviour is perceived as bullying without it being intended to be so, as I mentioned earlier. And we hope that we can help people to understand the generational and cultural differences between members of the team, and help them to realise how their behaviours can affect other people. But there's also a whole host of links to other organisations who can help with this behaviour, and some resources, some literature, how you stand in law, and covers some of the things that I talked about this evening. So I hope that's given a useful overview to this really difficult issue. It's obviously a problem across the NHS and in multiple specialties, not just surgery. But I hope that, whilst accepting that it can be a really difficult thing to report and discuss these problems, and there's little faith in the reporting systems as they stand at the moment, but there are people and groups and tools out there that can give you the confidence on how to deal with it. So I hope I've been able to give you a reasonable understanding of that this evening.